Okay, this video is going to focus on gas exchange. And before we get to gas exchange, we have to think about what the composition of air is including. So we know that it's mostly nitrogen, 78.6%, and then oxygen at almost 21%, and then a teeny bit of carbon dioxide and a little bit of water vapor as well. It is a mixture of all of these gases. Now, this is going to go into some chemistry lessons that I don't really think you need, but it's just saying that these gases, even though they're mixed together, they're acting independently. So they are a mixture. I always think of a mixture like a fruit salad. So while they are all coming in together, they are not influencing each other in any way. So this talks about their pressures are being different. And so you're going to see POH or PH2O. I'm not really worried about numbers. I hate to oversimplify this, but that's kind of what I'm going to do, only so that you can understand it. So the air that we breathe in and the air that makes it to the alveoli is different because the air gets humidified by contact with the mucous membranes. So as it goes through the airway, you know that airway is lined with mucous membranes, and so that as it comes in, the air is changed a little bit. So at the alveoli, we are going to focus on alveolar gas exchange. So that is when the air that's made it to the alveoli is in contact with a film of water covering that epithelium. Remember, alveoli is like a grape, and it's got a film or a layer of water, and that helps oxygen to get into the blood. It has to dissolve in this water and then go through the membrane to the blood, and then vice versa. For carbon dioxide to leave the blood, it has to pass in the opposite direction and then diffuse from the water into the air. Again, a little chemistry. We're going to skip. So at the alveoli, the blood is unloading the carbon dioxide. Okay, it's releasing the carbon dioxide and then is loading or getting the oxygen. This involves the red blood cells, and how efficient this process is does depend on how long a red blood cell stays in those capillaries. And then again, this is a mixture of gases. So the loading of the oxygen doesn't depend on the unloading of the carbon dioxide. Those gases can behave independently of each other. They don't influence each other as they're diffusing in opposite directions. Again, absolutely be watching all of these animations. They're really going to help you visualize what's going on. And so this gas exchange at the alveoli can depend on quite a few factors. And so we'll talk about some of these. They're all in your book, but some of them I'm not going to spend too much time on. But it does depend on these factors. So the gradient or the pressure gradient of the gases. So again, we need to have that difference in pressure for the air to be moving. And so the pressure gradient of the gases does have to be there for gas exchange to happen at the alveoli. This talks about when different pressures are lower. I'm not too worried about that. We also have to keep in mind that for gas exchange to occur, the gases have to be soluble. Soluble means to be able to dissolve in water. Well, we just said there was a thin layer of water over the alveoli, and both gases that we need to transfer through the alveoli, oxygen and carbon dioxide, have to be soluble. Well, carbon dioxide is much more soluble than oxygen, and so carbon dioxide is much more soluble and is able to diffuse much more rapidly than oxygen. But again, they're not depending on each other. So the oxygen can go slow and steady. Okay, also the gas exchange depends on the surface area. So we said that the alveoli is like a bundle of grapes, and so that surface area is very important. The more surface area there is, the more gas exchange that can take place. But when we get to disorders, we are going to talk about some disorders that decrease the surface area, and emphysema, lung cancer, and tuberculosis, to name a few. The membrane thickness We want a thin membrane, only 0.5 micrometers thick, and if that thin membrane allows diffusion to occur. But sometimes there's thickening of that membrane. Example is pulmonary edema or pneumonia. And so that thicker membrane makes a bigger distance between the blood and the air. And so then, again, we're just not being as efficient. It's still happening, but the red blood cell has to stay there longer. And so it's just not as efficient as if the membrane was thinner. Okay, and then this last part has lots of pictures about this in your book and also in this PowerPoint, but the ventilation perfusion coupling. So it basically means that we know that everything is connected, and so we want good ventilation of the alveoli, which means a constant air coming in, going across the alveoli, but that air needs somewhere to go. So, and I guess I should be more specific. Those gases need somewhere to go. So that needs good perfusion of the capillaries. So both of those, they need to be in sync, if you want to think about that. Okay, this is just all about the ventilation and perfusion, and it talks about blood flow matching the airflow and airflow matching the blood flow. So we then, once the gases have crossed into the blood cells, then they are transported to the systemic tissues and then vice versa. So we talked a little bit about this in the circulatory system and talking about the blood, but we're going to mention a little bit more percentages and specifics here. So the process of carrying those gases is gas transport. Once the gas exchange has happened, the gas transport is happening. And so oxygen, we know, is bound to the hemoglobin. And then this talks about how carbon dioxide is transported. I don't really need you to memorize these percentages, but just realize that carbon dioxide is not really all in one place like oxygen is. It is traveling in the plasma. Some of it is bound to hemoglobin, which we don't really talk about that too much, but it is. And then other is as the bicarbonate ion. So not as CO2, but as a bicarbonate ion. So this goes into a little bit more about hemoglobin. I feel like we've covered enough about hemoglobin. What I want to cover, we know that one hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens at a time. And so if it's 100% saturated, it means it's carrying 4 oxygen. 50% would be carrying only 2. And then this talks about the carbon dioxide being transported, some as carbonic acid, some in the plasma, and then some as that bicarbonate ion. Again, I don't really need you to memorize those percentages. Just realize that not all of the carbon dioxide is carried in the same way like the oxygen is. Okay, so at the tissues, the systemic gas exchange needs to occur. So now these gases have made it to the tissues, and we need to unload the oxygen and then load the carbon dioxide at the systemic capillaries. We know that our blood brings oxygen that the tissues need for cellular respiration, and then we know our cells are, when they're doing cellular respiration, that they are producing or getting rid of carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide needs to be removed from the tissues. So the carbon dioxide is loaded, it diffuses into the blood, and the oxygen is unloaded. So it is arriving and staying at the tissues. Again, I realize that it feels like I'm oversimplifying it, but that's because I am. Because I want you to really retain it, and let's not get lost in these percentages and what's happening. But this is a visual of what's happening in the lungs, the respiring tissue. I shouldn't say in the lungs. I'm so sorry. Not in the lungs. The respiring tissue. The tissue's doing a cellular respiration. So this is showing that they are getting rid of or unloading the carbon dioxide, putting that on the red blood cells, and the red blood cell is delivering that oxygen. I'm so sorry. I saw the word respiring and I jumped to a conclusion. Then This other picture is showing basically the opposite, what's happening in the lungs. That the carbon dioxide is going from the blood, diffusing through that membrane and going to the alveolar air, which is going to be exhaled. At the same time, the oxygen at the alveoli is getting loaded onto the capillary, into the blood in the capillaries. This talks about 4 factors that it can have adjust the rate of oxygen unloading. I'm not really picky about all of these. I mean, read through this in your textbook, but again, I feel like this is getting into a little more detail than we need to be. And then this goes into a whole thing about hydrogen ions. I think you can read through that. It talks about when the hydrogen ions are too high or too low. There's names for all of those things. Just read through there. But I'll be honest, I think there's other disorders for the respiratory system that we should focus on instead. So I am going to jump to that in the next video.